Hi there! I can guess why you're here today. Let's learn about liquids and their properties. We're going to show you 3 different experiments that you can do with your student at home. So why don't you come onto the kitchen, grab a seat, goggles and apron, and let's get down to it.
Alright, now remember, you need your safety materials. So you got to get your apron and your goggles, and then we'll head over to the first experiment. For the first experiment, you got to make sure you have 2 things. A cup of cooking oil and a cup of water. Alright, now remember last week we talked about how water is a polar substance. And we also talked about how oil is a non-polar substance. Let's see what happens when we mix these 2 things together. As you can see, the 2 liquid substances have totally separated, with no mixing, no stirring, all by themselves. That's because this top substance right here is oil, which is hydrophobic, which means that it doesn't like water, and they'll never mix together. I'll show you. Oh yeah. So let's get down to it. As you can see, after shaking it up, the 2 substances have already separated once again. And this displays perfectly the polar property that we talked about in class already. So now, it's on to the next experiment.
Alright guys, so let's get down to this next project. The next project materials include a package of Kool-Aid of any flavor and about 2 cups of water in a clear glass and a spoon. So remember how in class we talked about how water has a positive charge and how when you mix things like salt or Kool-Aid that has a negative charge, they mix together and dissolve. Check this out. As you can see, the Kool-Aid crystals have dissolved into the water. This is because one of the properties of water is that it is positively charged, which pulls apart the negatively charged Kool-Aid crystals, therefore making it either look invisible or dissolve. So now that we have talked about how water can dissolve certain substances, let's move on to the next experiment.
Now let's get down to it. The materials that you are going to need for this next experiment is a stove, a pan that has a lid on it, and about 2 to 3 cups of water. So in class we talked about how one of the properties of water is that it can change into different phases. For the next part of the experiment, you need to heat water on the stove on the highest setting for about 10 minutes until it boils. As you can see, as the water heats up, it begins to boil. As it boils, it releases steam. This steam is actually the gaseous form of water. When water converts from liquid to gas, this is called evaporation. So the exact opposite of evaporation is when water converts from a gas to a liquid. Check out what happens when I put this lid on. Little water droplets begin to accumulate at the top of the lid. This is because the water begins to cool down and has less energy, which makes it convert back into water. This process is known as condensation. This is another phase water can go through.
Alright, so let's recap some of the properties about water that we learned today. First, let's talk about the fact that water is polar. This is important because since water is polar, this allows or does not allow water to mix with certain substances. In our case, we talked about how water does not mix with oil, and this is because oil is a hydrophobic substance. This means that it does not like to mix with water. On top of that, we also saw that the oil sat at the top of the glass while the water sat down at the bottom. This is because the density of the water was more than the oil. And the second property that we learned about with water was that it has a positive charge. This is important because, as we saw in the Kool-Aid experiment, water can be used to dissolve certain substances, like Kool-Aid or salt, such as the salt that you find on your kitchen table. The reason for this is because the positive charge in the water breaks apart the negatively charged salt or Kool-Aid, therefore making the salt or Kool-Aid dissolve so small that it looks invisible. Last but not least, the third property that we talked about with water was that it can change into several different phases. This was seen with the pot of boiling water. As we added heat to the water, it began to boil. When the water boiled, it released a gaseous phase of water, known as water vapor. This was water turning in from liquid to a gas, which is known as evaporation. After that, we saw that as we put the lid onto the pan, that water began to accumulate at the top in little forms of water drops. This is because the steam that was hot as it rose from the boiling water started to cool down as it hit the top of the pan. This is known as condensation, the transformation of water from gas to liquid.
So get out there and do these experiments so you and your student can get down to it!